plan here is I'm going to kind of ask you a bunch of questions for the next sort of 10, 15 minutes. I'll just take some notes while you're talking. And the real purpose of this call is all about simplification, right? Sort of a great book is simple but not easy, meaning it's a simple premise to understand what the book's about. It's obviously not easy to sort of do what the book tells you. And I think I'd say most authors at this point are more in the vein of complicated and not easy. So we'll try to help with some of the simplification stuff and sort of see where it takes us a little bit. So sound like a plan?
Yep, sounds great.
Perfect. All right. So why don't we start here? I know kind of where the book's going at a high level and kind of some of the stuff you've been sharing. It was helpful. I like to start with this idea of a story. Is there a story that you sort of think best illustrates kind of the big idea behind this book? This could be a story from someone you've interviewed, a story from, the news, someone famous, your own personal story, but you're on stage talking about this book. And you want to tell a story to the audience. What story do you tell them to help them understand kind of what the idea behind this book is?
So just like a singular story, right? Not like not the overarching story of the book itself, but
correct.
Singular.
Singular story. Yep.
I think that probably Lil Nas X's story really illustrates the overall theme of the book, which is the ability to use memes to achieve your dreams. Just because of how he utilized the Yeehaw challenge to kind of bring himself into the spotlight. And he essentially crafted his own reality in a sense because he forced it or utilized the aspects of the internet in such a way that his success just occurred. So I think that Lil Nas X's was a really just kind of like the ideal way to display how powerful memes actually are. And I think it's a well-known one because everyone at this point has heard Lil Nas X's Old Town Road. So
my daughter's singing almost every day now. So I know well. That's cool. So tell me then, we talked about this a little bit before, but great books have this element of attention, right? They have this everyone thinks this, but I think something else, sort of this unconventional wisdom. What do you want the tension to sort of be in this book?
So I think my tension is that everyone thinks of memes as just a form of funny pictures, but they're actually a powerful force for good and creative expression and a way to communicate on the internet. Just in one sentence, just a creative expression, form of communication, and way that you can move the world.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And then, tell me a little bit about kind of your audience. So you want someone to read this one. What do you want them to sort of do differently after they read it? Who's reading it? And then what do you want them to change or do differently after they sort of read your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was recently talking with my mother about it, and I was talking with her about OK Boomer and that whole concept. And so after I talked about it, when I was just in the process of just describing the actual concept, I mentioned Reddit. And so I kind of described subreddits because that was a necessary part of the story. And from that point on, she downloaded Reddit and started sending me memes from Reddit. And so that's kind of what I want from everyone is I want to increase that level of communication between someone and their parents or someone and their grandparents. And so in my mind, it's a book that people can buy and give to, their dad or their mom, and just to kind of explain everything that they think is funny and what their life is like on the internet. But I still want it to be accessible and not I want it to be not overly simplified to the point where people who are my age or understand memes completely aren't bored by it. They're not just oh yeah, I know all this. So I guess that's the thing, is that my audience is pretty broad. It's pretty much everyone in a sense.
Yep. So in some ways, kind of what you're describing here, in some ways, is memes are starting to represent almost a shared. So I guess I was is historically we had sort of television and sort of sort of a consistent way that we sort of created this shared cultural phenomenon, and sort of that started to fade as television has not, sort of changed in those things. But what you're describing here a little bit is memes are this almost like becoming this universal platform for communication. But we have to like sort of recognize that's what they are and sort of use them in these sorts of ways as the internet becomes our primary channel. So tell me a little bit about like, because almost you're creating this world of like the meme, people who sort of view memes and use memes and talk in memes and people who don't. What is the sort of like the communication that this like communication platform sort of, how do people think about that as like a tool, as an understanding of the meme culture versus the others? What do they do differently?
Yeah, so I feel as if to bridge that gap, you really just need to explain it. And you need to, like break down the different platforms that people use, the cultural differences between the individual platforms, and the just little nuances of the memes themselves. That's kind of how I plan on doing it through the story format of just explaining why things work in certain ways and why there's different tones and different your Facebook persona is different from your Instagram persona, so you're going to have a different type of meme there, and you're going to have a different internet profile or internet persona on Twitter versus Instagram as well. And so I think the way of explaining that is by telling the stories of events that have occurred and showing how these things that have happened display these properties of the internet, if that makes sense. So does that properly answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. So tell me more on that one. I think like, you talk about, sort of different personas, like what are some of the other things that are sort of people that use memes in a way, you just talk about your mom. Sounds like that you have to sort of like, explain and understand different platforms, have different personas on platforms. What are some of the other things that sort of participate in sort of this meme culture? What do you have to do?
Yeah, so there's a base level understanding of pop culture, of course. And so I think that's very important for pretty much all memes. And a part of that is also being, there's pop culture itself, and then there's recent events and things that are actually occurring in the world that is necessary. So there's a certain level of being up to date on culture itself, because if, for example, one of the biggest memes that's going on right now is Baby Yoda. And so like Baby Yoda is from The Mandalorian, which is on Disney Plus, which if you don't have Disney Plus, then you're kind of out of the loop. And so there's an aspect of overall internet culture that you need to understand, but there's also a pop culture aspect that's really necessary. And then that kind of folds into political events as well, because there's memes that are constantly going around that are involved in, world events. And so if you don't know what's going on in the world, then you don't understand the most recent meme, whether or not that's a global phenomenon or a pop culture phenomenon. And so I think that being connected is a big part of it, where it's, if you're not into the zeitgeist at a certain moment in time and you're off Twitter for 3 days, you don't know. Like, you come back. I remember I deleted Twitter for 3 or 4 days about just because it was taking up so much of my time. And my friend was like, "Do you know what's going on about cats eating small bits of salami?" Which is just a nonsense sentence. I was just like, that doesn't.
Right.
I have no clue what you're talking about.
Right.
And then I finally got on Instagram for the day because I hadn't been on, and I saw a couple memes about it. And he was like, "Yeah, that's been all over Twitter for the past 3 or 4 days, and no one really knows what's going on. That's nonsense." And so I think that that's a big part of it, is just that those levels of understanding. And I think that's one of the reasons that the generational gap exists, is because if you're a bit older, you don't necessarily feel the need, or you have the knowledge to stay as up to date as it is easy for people my age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some really interesting things here. So tell me a little bit about in terms of why was this something that you felt called to write? What was sort of the motivation for you saying, hey, was there a moment in time where you recognized this was something important for you?
I don't know if there's a specific moment because I keep getting that question. I keep trying to boil it down to like a moment in time, but I think it was I remember when I had the idea several years ago, but I don't remember a specific interaction that brought it on. I know it was around the idea of trying to explain a meme to my mom and her not understanding it. And then I think that I was just sitting at work and it just came to me that it was a completely misunderstood medium because there was a complete lack of understanding, and there was not just one level that was lost on the older generation, but it was several. You needed several tiers of understanding in order to understand the format itself, the pop culture aspect, or specific niche internet humor. So I think that was really what brought it on, was just having that experience probably several times of trying to show my mom something that I thought was hilarious and didn't connect with her at all.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So, yeah, I mean, I think you got a bunch here. I think, part of the secret of this one, I think, is going to be to sort of simplify this in a way that isn't sort of, it's funny because you're talking about something that is really cute on one hand and like, oh, Baby Yoda, blah, blah, blah. But I think you're trying to do something much bigger. And so I think you're going to have to kind of like find that simple angle that almost takes a bigger position about what you're doing here a little bit. So let's share a couple thoughts here. I think, the biggest thing that I want you to do kind of coming out of this call is I want you to actually try and write your introduction. And so if you think about your book as a movie, right, the introduction is not the first 5 minutes of the movie, right? The better way to think about it is like the movie trailer. And it makes the case for why go see it. And, sort of there's a little formula to it, which kind of thinks what I found with authors are able to kind of unlock this like logic train of how they want this sort of to play out. Their book really does unlock for them. So I'll share a couple thoughts that I wrote down, but I think you're close to it. I think it's just going to be this idea of like, I think you're onto something, but I think it's about making sure that people realize that this isn't some cute book, but you're making a much bigger statement that I think about the power of what's going on in this sort of, again, OK Nas represents something much bigger. And I know that one because the fact that my 5-year-old, and 3-year-olds sing these songs from, Lil Nas X, they like help us understand and bridge like them to me. So there's something interesting really that you're tapping on that I think is powerful. So let me share a couple thoughts here and see if this helps. So I pasted the thoughts that I had sort of at the bottom of your big idea document here, so you can just see, you can find them a little bit. And so the idea is there's these 7 core elements that make an introduction. These 7 elements are kind of the ways to sort of, again, make the case. So as you're writing these sort of bold capitalized sections, these are kind of the places that I would say kind of try to address each of them and then see how they stitch together as you go. But I think once you kind of cover each of them, this will help you with that movie trailer. So I love the idea of Lil Nas X. I love it for 2 reasons. One is it's this sort of like story that's like this subculture piece, but it's how subculture became a way that we sort of connect in this bigger way, right? It almost like blew the doors off of TikTok as this like cultural phenomenon. But like, anyway, there's something really interesting about it where like the story of like country music and pop culture, like so many intersection points happen through this like meme culture, right? So there's a big thing here that I think you may stitch the entire introduction. But I think that's interesting is like memes are powerful. We often discount them, but the truth is that they represent the next wave of connection for our country or our world, right? And I think what I sort of thought as you were talking here is like, in a polarized world, memes are the new thing that bind us, right? And I think that's kind of the interesting thing is that we've got this world where we sort of think about us and them, but memes are this thing that are cross-cutting now. We sort of have these interesting things that kind of come across these things. And so I think in the current state of the world, sort of this next section, you want to talk a little bit about this idea of disconnection, loneliness, and tribalism, and these things that are going on right here. And, in some ways, I think that everyone thinks that memes are these funny pictures here. But then I think what you want to talk about here is this own story, like how you realize that this is the thing that binds you to people that are that you're not like, that are not connected to you in these ways. Like the story of like, being off Twitter and reconnecting with a friend when you were, why you had to get back on it, because you realize this is how you communicate today. And this story of your mom is a really great one. I think this way of like realizing now that your mom is now sending you memes from Reddit is an interesting way to sort of almost like the okay boomer thing is a bad thing. It actually is like this like tribalism disconnecting thing. But really what you're saying is doing is bringing us back together. So I think that like this idea here is we're struggling for shared communication, and memes are the way to bind us like back to each other. It's this thing that like we have to actually embrace them, because the way I would actually think of it is it's the new TV, like sort of like, the new sort of like, sort of must see TV that like my generation had, right? I don't think that you probably grew up with must see TV, but like Thursday night television, we all watched the same shows. And so like the numbers were huge, but like now it just doesn't happen that way. So there's not a lot of these shared like things that are happening, shared cultural phenomena.
Yeah, you don't go to school the next day and talk about what you saw on TV the previous night. You go to school and you talk about, did you see that meme?
Totally. So that's the big thing here, I think. And so I kind of wrote this down. I think this even could be your title. Okay, meme. Why internet culture represents the new face of connection, or the new something like that. This idea here of like positioning it as like it's important for us to understand. And even I think there's some things here that we need to like, you need to teach people how to communicate in that way when they want to be more connected. And so I kind of was like writing how you might even structure the book a little bit here as you were talking. So I think you've got to talk a little bit about like how we got here and the history of like shared cultural era. So the radio era, the television era, and now why today we've kind of lost that one because of, what are the forces happening? And the internet is this shared culture, but it's sort of like memes are actually the shared cultural phenomenon, not like the internet, right? It's like the internet is like pulling us apart, but memes are pulling us together.
Yeah, it's the
sort of like
of the internet. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, it's the next version, right? Like it's the new thing for television, like must see TV. Like there's something in that one. And then kind of like explaining the principles behind why it's shared in this way and like these things. And so, they have this pop culture, different platforms, participation. It focuses on connectedness, consistency, consumption. You remix these ideas. There's an openness to them. Like the sort of the why it works are these sorts of like lots of principles of it. And then I think in some ways like of how to like, I think what's interesting here is like how to like use meme culture to connect, right? Like how to how to learn to, maybe it's connect to connect and communicate in meme culture. So, if you want to like bridge the gap on politics, how to use meme culture, or entertainment, or, different sort of like, I don't know, race, religion. Like, I think there's something here about this idea here of you see this as this powerful force to start to like break boundaries as opposed to create boundaries a little bit. So I'll pause there for thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a great breakdown and generally how I wanted to go about it. I didn't have a section yet on the like the history of shared culture. I think that's a really important aspect because you do need to kind of bring it in. If you're going to have it as a generational book, you need to kind of compare it. And I thought about that on an individual level of being like, yeah, you could compare it to pins or little comics like in the Sunday Funnies. But I think probably, are we still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry. Yeah.
No, this is screen sharing and it switched me windows. And so I think that that's a good place to start because you do kind of need to give that background information in the sense of like why this is that. And in my mind, I'd always started it with why, like how the actual memes work instead of starting it with the aspect of shared culture and how this is a representation. And I was just planning on working the history into it at the same time. But it makes more sense to probably separate those two so that way you don't try to inundate anybody with too much information and be like, oh, I have to learn how memes work and why they're important in the same sentence.
I think the idea here a little bit, if I were to sort of play it back, is I think you've got to tie in sort of like part of the challenge of loneliness, depression, sort of like disconnectedness into the fact that like we've lost a shared culture. And so like we're in this sort of transition phase from sort of like radio, television, and like the internet one, we haven't really like figured that out yet. And so in some ways, what you're making the case for is meme culture is that sort of new thing. And I think you're right in it, right? In some ways, that is a thing. And I think that what's the risk here is that, if people don't plug into that one, we're gonna only increase the disconnection. And so your argument is to sort of say, we need to become more open with meme culture, more sort of accepting, more sharing. And so I would almost argue too that okay boomer is a bad idea. So like it's a bad meme because it's a disconnecting meme as opposed to connecting
Yeah.
meme. And I think there's some ways of looking at this idea here of meme culture that sort of tribalizes us versus
Yeah.
meme culture that binds us.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's why I thought it was a perfect way to represent the generational gap and the divide that occurs, and why, you know, millennials feel as if the boomers have wronged them. And
That's
why,
right.
like, and
Yeah.
I think that that's like what it really boils down to, is that it represents that resentment that occurs and is just present in our society, and then it's manifested into a meme, and
That's
because
right.
that's how we think. And so I like, and exactly, I've got a chapter about community creation, about
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
how, you know, we can use that division that's already existing, and then use the internet to bring us back together. And so I
Right.
think like you've pretty much hit on exactly what I want to do with it.
Good. Good. Yeah. I mean, I think you're onto something here. I really do. I think once you can kind of unlock the introduction, make the argument here of this, because I think, again, I think this book is a lot bigger than just it's memes as this shared cultural understanding, which is a big idea, right? I mean, it really, really
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, take a stab at the introduction. And the second thing that I was going to share with you too is I think this is a really interesting book that may lend itself well to like a speaking kind of tour and almost even like a workshop tour. So what I mean by that is I think that there's this opportunity for you to, you know, colleges and organizations, and almost describe this way of like of organizations seeking community and understanding how to use memes as a way to like bring people together. And so the reason I bring that up is I think if you're intentional about some of these, like thinking of where you could bring this out, I think you've got an opportunity here. So what I'll do is I'll connect you to Brian Bees, who's on the publisher side. Worth talking to him a little bit about like the sort of speaking tour aspect. I've got several of my authors who've done that really well, like workshops and speaking. This is the sort of one that the book will be really interesting, but in some ways you have to like teach people to do exactly what you did with your mom, which is like how to actually like connect to other people through memes in this way to like bring it. Like it's such a compelling story. I heard you say it and I was like, that's awesome that you got closer to your mom and she's sending you these things. That's awesome. And I can imagine you saying is like, how many of you have sent a meme to your mom? And like, you know, people raise their hand if you know, like whatever. How many of you have ever had your mom send a meme to you? And like, no one raises their hand. Like, listen, what I want to do today is I want to teach you how to basically create this shared cultural experience with your parents, with your, you know, these things around here through the power of memes. And like, what I found is like, this is the new way, the new must-see TV, the new whatever it is for us that maybe will bring us together in a world that sort of wants to disconnect. So I think there's something really interesting here about this idea of like exposing what's going on, but more importantly, giving people tools to help use this as a way to connect.
Yeah, I'd never thought about it like that, because I think that if you do kind of present and open up that world that this is something that exists, but then you don't give people necessarily the tools in order to achieve that, it is hard, because there's a lot of other things you need to know how to do in order
That's
to
right.
achieve that. Like, you know, have good communication skills and not look down on your parents and talk to them as if, oh, you don't know that meme. You know, so I think that I'd never thought about it from like a speaking or workshop perspective.
Yep.
But I can see that potential now that you've said that.
Yeah, I think the world needs the meme whisperer, which is sort of like, you know, like it really,
Yeah.
I mean it, right? It's like
No,
a funny
I feel
thing,
the
but
same
like,
way. I really do.
yeah. And your story is so authentic with you and your mother that I think there's something here that I can see you again going in colleges and other, you know, sort of high schools and talking about this sort of thing here is like, we think it's hilarious, but actually like there's research that shows the shared language, the shared culture is important. And so if you want to basically have these better relationships, here's what you need to sort of do on it.
And
So
I think it's really interesting, because it seems that almost everyone's looking for why we feel so disconnected at the moment.
exactly.
And I
And
think
that's part of the secret here, right? Is you've got this different message that I think really resonates in those ways. So yeah, listen, I mean, take a step of the introduction, but like, I think as you keep thinking about it, like think about that story between you and your mother as the sort of the centerpiece here of what you want to do. Because even hearing you say it, I was like, gosh, I should figure out, like, I sort of have this like dismissive thing because my mom sort of only knows how to use social media to like promote like religious causes and you know what I mean? And I was like, well, what if we did have that shared thing that we could sort of have these fun things, and like it's an interesting idea here. So I'm excited for you. I think you really, really have something here, and I think it's important. I really do.
I do too, Eric. It feels important. It feels like it's something like, and it's interesting too, because when I tell people about it, they either get it or they don't. It's like
That's
one of
right.
those things where it's like, oh, okay, that's cool, like memes,
Yeah.
or it's like, oh, like, yeah, like that's makes complete sense. Like there's such an important representation of like what's going on in the world, da, 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 da. But
Yep.
it's really interesting. It's been a good experience so far. I also
Good.
talked with Mackenzie, thinking,
Good. Yeah.
yeah, and so we had a good conversation and loved her TED talk. It touched on a lot of the things that I've wanted to explore throughout the book, and so that was a great connection. So I appreciate that.
Good. Good. Yeah. I'm excited. I think there's something here. Like I said, I'll put a little note in your update room so your editor knows we chatted about these things. I think churn through the editor, with your editor to get this to that right place.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I mean, keep in mind, I think the centerpiece of that story between you and your mother is sort of a center of what you want the sort of the outcome to be. Like, again, this idea here of like as a connection tool rather than a division tool. That's kind of the goal that I think is really different here.
Yeah, absolutely, Eric. I
Cool.
completely agree.
Awesome, man. I'm excited for you. Keep me
Thank you.
keep me posted here, and I think you got something on your hands.
I appreciate it. Thanks for spending the time with me today, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work on it.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon, Shane. Be well.
All right,
Bye.
bye-bye.